Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and in today's video, we'll be exploring the poem Partition by Sujata Bhatt. Now, this poem was written in response to a deeply traumatic event, the partition of India. So before we look at the poem, we need to make sure that we all understand what that was. So very briefly, you may know that before the Second World War, India was part of the British Empire. But after the war, in 1947, India gained independence from the British Empire, and at the same time, India was divided or partitioned into two countries, India and Pakistan, and you can see those divisions on the map here. Now, this division or this partition was deeply traumatic. Many people found that all of a sudden they lived on the wrong side of a border from where they wanted to be, and between 14 and 18 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes. It's estimated that it's one of the largest forced migrations of people in human history. Furthermore, partition prompted a huge wave of violence in many places, and it's estimated that 1 million people tragically died because of partition. This event still has repercussions that are being felt even now, and it's the key thing which is explored in today's poem. So before we look at the poem, as we often do in these videos, I'm just going to think about what conflict we might expect to see. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're going to see the conflict and the trauma caused by the partition of India and Pakistan. We'll see some political conflict. We'll see the narrator's mother express views about the political decision to partition India. And we'll also see lots of emotional conflict, specifically lots of guilt and anxiety for how one of the characters in this poem acted during partition. So what we'll do now is we'll read through the poem. I'll go through it a second time to check that we understand all the key words, and then we'll go through it a third time, picking out any language or structural features that you might find useful to think about if you write about this in an exam. So here we go, Partition by Sujata Bhatt. She was 19 years old then, and when she stood in her garden, she could hear the cries of the people stranded in the Ahmedabad railway station. She felt it was endless, their noise. A new sound added to the city. Her aunt, her father's sister, would go to the station every day with food and water, but she felt afraid, felt she could not go with her aunt, so she stood in the garden, listening. Even the birds sounded different, and the shadows cast by the neem trees brought no consolation. And each day she wished she had the courage to go with her aunt, and each day passed with her listening to the cries of the people. Now, when my mother tells me this at midnight in her kitchen, she is 70 years old, and India is 50. But of course, India is older than that, she says. India was always there. But how I wish I had gone with my aunt to the railway station. I still feel guilty about that. And then she asks me, how could they have let a man who knew nothing about geography divide a country? So what's going on in this poem? We have a 19-year-old girl who's standing in her garden, and she can hear the crying of people from a nearby railway station. And presumably these are people who have been displaced because of partition, and their cries reflect how desperate their situation is. Maybe these people are desperately trying to find their families. Maybe they're trying to get to safety. Maybe they were told that the place they've called home for years and years and years is no longer their home, or they're not in the country where they want to be, and they've got to travel many miles for safety. And hearing all of these cries, hearing all of this noise, the 19-year-old feels overwhelmed. She feels unable to help. She's just still because she can't do anything. She feels afraid. Her aunt goes and helps. Her aunt goes and takes food and water, but she can't do anything because she feels so afraid. She wishes she had the courage to go, but she just can't. So are there any words we need to pick out here just to check we understand them? So first of all, I've picked out Ahmedabad, which is a city in India. I've picked out here on a map. Also neem trees. So neem trees are just types of trees you might find on the Indian subcontinent. And finally, I haven't picked out, but the word consolation, I haven't highlighted it, but here we go. Consolation just means to offer help and support. So if she's brought no consolation, it means she's not been brought help or support. In the second part of the poem, we have a flash forward in time. So look at line 20, it says, "Now, when my mother tells me this at midnight in her kitchen." So this tells us that the 19-year-old woman who was mentioned in the first part of the poem, she's moved forward in time, she's now 70 years old, and that's the narrator's mother. So we've learnt that it was the narrator's mother who was telling us about when she was 19 years old in the garden, feeling unable to help given the traumatic circumstances of partition. And we hear the mother's reflections on those events, how she's recognising the fact that India is officially 50 years old, 50 years since it achieved independence, but of course India is older than that, has a very deep, rich and vibrant history which needs to be recognised and celebrated. There's a sense of guilt for not doing more in partition, for not doing much more, but it was a very traumatic and very difficult set of circumstances, and she was 19 years old. And then there's this really angry question at the end. How could they have let a man who knew nothing about geography divide a country? This man could be one of two people. It could be a reference to Lord Mountbatten, who was the last Viceroy of India. It was on his watch that partition happened, and many people hold him accountable for the trauma of partition. It could also be a reference to Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who was the man who was tasked with drawing the lines on the map to divide India from Pakistan. He did it in 5 weeks. He didn't know India very well, and given how traumatic it ended up being, many hold him accountable too. So let's begin looking at the poem a bit more closely and think about some of the language and structural features that you might want to comment on if you're going to write about this poem in an exam. So we begin the poem with a 19-year-old. This is the mother we see later on in the poem, but she's younger at this stage. She's 19 years old, standing in a garden. She can hear the cries of the people stranded in the Ahmedabad railway station, feeling it was endless. Okay, what's really interesting is if you look at the verbs that are used, so the verbs of the doing words, the active words that are used to describe the 19-year-old. She stood, she heard, she could hear, she felt. These are all passive verbs. What I mean by passive is she's not doing anything actively. So things are happening to her. So she's hearing, she's passively hearing, she's passively feeling, she's not going into her garden, she's standing in a garden, she's just there. And these passive verbs, I think, highlight how just passively inactive the 19-year-old woman is in partition. She feels really helpless in this stage of her life because partition is just so overwhelming. And this sense of being overwhelmed is exaggerated by the oral imagery. So oral imagery is just a fancy way of saying sound imagery. So we have the cries of the people, people who are stranded in the station but wanting to go elsewhere. We have their noise, a new sound added. I would suggest that all of this oral imagery exaggerates the despair of the people who have been displaced because of partition. And this is exaggerated even further, forgive the pun, by hyperbole. She felt that the noise was endless, so it's never ending, perhaps a reference to the large number of people who were displaced because of partition. And there's some really interesting structural decisions made by the poet to really emphasize the despair of those who were displaced because of partition. So the technique enjambment is when you have a sentence which continues over a line break without a pause or without any punctuation. So have a look at the sentence here. She could hear the cries of the people stranded. So can we see how stranded carries on to the next line without any punctuation to pause it, and no full stops here. That enjambment makes the word stranded stand out in a way that I don't think it would if there was no enjambment. So the enjambment draws readers' attention to the adjective stranded, which just highlights how vulnerable people have been made because of partition. We have that same effect happening later on in the poem. We have the word listening is made to stand out to us because of the enjambment. And in the same way that earlier I was making the argument that the 19-year-old is a bit passive, she feels a bit overwhelmed, there's nothing she can do. Once again, we have the word listening, which is drawn to our attention, which just really exaggerates how helpless she feels. I don't think I've formally put this on the PowerPoint, but as I'm just talking, I've just noticed that the word stood is actually repeated. I'm just going to just highlight it in a gaudy yellow colour. Apologies for that. But the repetition of stood, once again, we've got the repetition of this passive verb, which just really exaggerates how this 19-year-old girl cannot do very much. I feels very overwhelmed in the face of partition. We have more oral imagery later on in the poem, which is really interesting. These are some of my favourite quotes in the poem. Even the birds sounded different. So birds normally connote or normally make readers think about something beautiful, something really, really pleasant. Birdsong is famously wonderful. But if the birds sound different, that suggests that something isn't quite right. And perhaps that mirrors how not right partition is from the perspective of the poet. I'm really interested by the poet's use of personification here. So the shadows cast by the neem trees brought no consolation. So this is personification because the shadows are not bringing something, they're not doing something, they're not bringing consolation. So that just means that the shadows don't make the 19-year-old feel any better. And I would suggest that this personification has the effect of showing just how desperate the situation is. There is no consolation from anything in the world right now because partition is so awful. Now, one thing that I'm really interested in this poem is how the poet uses contrast. So contrast is when we have two kind of opposite ideas put together, and we have a few examples of this in this poem. So we begin with the 19-year-old who's standing and hearing and feeling it's endless and not doing anything. She felt afraid. But in the same poem we have her aunt, who is going to the station with food and water, who is being proactive, who is trying to help when the 19-year-old can't. Now, I would suggest that by putting those two women together, it exaggerates how helpless the 19-year-old is because she just can't do anything, when by contrast her aunt is being proactive and is being really, really helpful. And that works the other way around as well. By putting the aunt next to the 19-year-old, it makes the aunt's action seem even more heroic or even more wonderful because there are so many others who just can't do that, so it makes her work seem all the more valuable. So we could talk about how this contrast between the 19-year-old and the aunt exaggerates how hopeless the 19-year-old felt. You could also talk about the contrast between the safe garden, which is where the narrator, I beg your pardon, which is where the 19-year-old is at the start of the poem, and the station, which doesn't sound particularly safe. We can hear the cries from the railway station. And that contrast, again, exaggerates just how terrifying the station is. By putting it next to a relatively safe garden, it makes the cries of the station seem all the more overwhelming, which exaggerates just how unsafe or how scary partition was. And we know that 1 million people died because of partition, and that is hinted at in this poem through just little words like cries of the people. And yet those words carry a lot of weight. They make reference to some really big tragedies. And I just want to talk about the use of caesura or caesuras in the plural. So if you're not sure what that is, a caesura is just when you have a pause in a poem, and that pause is created by punctuation. So for example, over here you can see these little dashes here. These dashes make the reader pause on those words. We have another example here, and the comma here, another dash here. Now, I would suggest that these caesuras, which appear throughout the poem, have the effect of making the tone of this poem quite fragmented. It's very stoppy-starty. don't write that in an exam, don't write stoppy starty, and it makes her fragmented tones, which you should write in the exam. I would suggest that the fragmented tone, which is caused by the caesuras, mirrors how fragmented and how upset the narrator feels when reflecting on the events caused by partition. Moving on to what I'm unofficially calling the second half of the poem. It's not really second half because it's just one continuous poem, but there is a notable change, and we know there's a change because it says, now when my mother tells me this at midnight in her kitchen, she is 70 years old. So we've had a change in time. We've moved to the present, and in the first part of the poem we were in the past. So we have a shift in time and tone. And we were just talking about contrast, weren't we? We talked about how the garden was safe and the railway station was unsafe. And I think in the same way, the relative safety of the narrator and the mother in the kitchen, thinking about the cries of the people in the railway station, that's another example of contrast, which just makes partition seem all the more unsafe and all the more dangerous. We then have dialogue used for the first time in this poem, and do notice please the quotation marks to make it really clear that this is spoken word. So here we have the mother, much older now, saying India was older than 50 years old. India was always there. And what that's responding to is the suggestion by some in the British Empire that they effectively made or discovered India, which is of course not true. As this poem says, India was always there. So this confident tone and this dialogue just rejects that sort of interpretation in the British Empire that they made India. Of course they didn't. India was always there. And this idea is exaggerated by just the ironic tone when the word 50 is used here. India is 50, in quotation marks, 50. Of course it's older than that. It's ironic to say India is 50 when actually it's got a very rich history, which is much older than 50 years old. And now we come to a really interesting part of the poem where we start to see indentations. So that's the fact that the text doesn't start along the margins like it does over here, but how it starts over here and not next to margins. Now I would suggest that these indentations, along with the caesuras, so these are the pauses like the dash here and the end stopping here, all of these indentations, caesuras, and even the enjambment, the flowing sentence nature, I would suggest it creates a very fragmented tone, which mirrors how fragmented and how frustrated the narrator feels when they hear their mother talking about the partition of India. And one example of that is when the mother says, I still feel guilty about that. The enjambment, the indentation, that sort of fragmentation could mirror how fragmented the mother feels in this case about not doing more in partition. And also we've talked about enjambment drawing attention to certain words. Here I think the enjambment and the indentation really draws attention to the word guilty, and it shows just how on a really personal level partition touched lots of different people, because even people who survived partition, they still carry very strong emotions with them even 50 years after the event, because it was such an overwhelming event and there was very little they could have done in those circumstances. And we end with this very powerful, angry rhetorical question. How could they have let a man who knew nothing about geography divide a country? Showing anger at the British Empire, which which contributed significantly to the partition of India. And we've talked a lot about contrast, haven't we? The contrast between this angry tone and the much less angry tone of the rest of the poem just really draws attention to the frustration which finally comes to the surface at the very end of this poem, showing a rejection of the British Empire, which caused partition to be such a horrific thing. Now, before I end, I would be remiss if I did not talk about this, which I just find really interesting. This whole poem is an example of post-colonial poetry. What does that mean? Well, post just means after, colonial is about empires, so post-colonial poetry explores the consequences of the colonial period, and in particular it explores the consequences of the decolonisation of India and specifically partition. And we see this in the content. We just saw that angry rhetorical question, didn't we, showing frustration. People like Mountbatten and Ratcliffe who divided India, which led to 14 to 18 million people being displaced and another million people tragically losing their lives. But we also see the guilt that it caused people to have. We saw how it affected lots of different people in very different ways. And we can look at this poem and think about how it challenges colonial values, how it challenges what happened in partition. But it doesn't just do that through the words of the poem. I would argue that the very form of the poem, these really interesting indentations and a few other things, the form of the poem challenges the values of the British Empire. What do I mean by that? Okay, have a look at this poem, Envy by Mary Lamb. You'll have hopefully seen this in your poetry anthology. This poem is quite typical of a lot of the poetry that came out of the British Empire. I'm not saying this is a British Empire poem thematically, but many poems from the colonial period had features like this. They had regular stanza lengths. They had a regular rhyme scheme, so bare and fair, discontent natural bent, even sort of regular rhythm. Now, you will have noticed that Partition does not have a regular rhyme scheme. It does not have neatly ordered stanzas like this. It does not have a consistent rhythm throughout. Because it does not have those features, it's a bit like the poet is saying, I don't want to write a poem that is in the form of poetry favoured by the British Empire. I don't want anything to do with the values of the British Empire. Partition is really, really awful. So my poem, and even the very form of it, is going to reject a lot of those forms that were favoured. So we don't have regular stanzas, we don't have a regular rhyme scheme, we don't have a regular rhythm, we even have these unusual indentations. And so all of these things together, by not using poetic features that were popularly used by poets in the British Empire at this time, could therefore be seen as a rejection of the values of the British Empire. And this is absolutely something you can write about in an exam. You wouldn't need to copy out the whole poem to do this. You could just say something like, the lack of rhyme scheme, ordered standards and a regular rhythm could be seen as a rejection of the values of the British Empire, and I'll put something on the screen to sort of summarise that nice and concisely for you. I hope that's okay. I just find that really, really interesting, and how poetry can be used to make a very powerful social commentary on a very tragic and traumatizing event. I'm going to bring the video to a close here, but before I do, I was asked in a comment recently if I could return to doing top 5 quotes from a poem. So here are some quotes that I think are really interesting or really useful to talk about in an exam context. One quick thing, you'll have noticed that I've put these forward slashes in the middle of some quotes. That's merely to indicate to the examiner that I recognise that in the real poem there's been a line break. If you're not sure what I mean by that, don't worry about it. It's not something that you will ever lose marks for if you don't do. But if you really wanted to show off your knowledge of how to quote really precisely, if you've got a line which continues over a line break in a poem, you can show that by including a forward slash. I hope that's useful. Good luck if you've got exams in the near future. If you have any more requests about poems or questions about how to approach poems, please let me know in the comments below. I do read them all. And until next time, cheerio.